For the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve. With this statement, Jesus is teaching his disciples, especially those who are seeking positions of power, privilege, and authority, that true discipleship means living a life as a slave or a servant to those around you. Jesus is saying that true leadership means putting the needs and the good of others before your own, and then leading others to do the same. Now, it would be worthwhile for each of us to ask ourselves then the question, am I living up to this call of service? How do I serve my family, my spouse, my coworkers, my friends, or even my parish? Do I come into these relationships or communities with an expectation of being served by them, or do I approach them looking for ways in which I can serve them? So these are all worthwhile questions for us to ask as we hear this gospel proclaimed today. However, if we do that, and only that, I believe that we'll perhaps miss the most essential part of this exchange between Jesus and his disciples. Because what is most important to our life of discipleship and ultimately our salvation is what Jesus says next. For the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. To give his life as a ransom for many. Let's take the next few minutes to consider the significance of that statement. Why is that so important to us? Now, keep in mind that this exchange is taking place immediately following Jesus' third and final prediction of his passion, death, and resurrection. 3 times now, he's told his disciples that he will suffer and he will die, and yet they don't seem to get it. Or at least they don't seem to want to get it, because they're more concerned with other matters. And Jesus is telling them here that as difficult as his death will be for him and for them, it won't be meaningless, senseless, but will instead have a definite purpose. His life will be given as a ransom for many. What does he mean? How is Jesus a ransom? And why is a ransom even needed? Well, if we look up the word ransom in a dictionary, that's that book with a bunch of words in it. Most of us just Google nowadays. We're going to find this. A ransom is, quote, a consideration paid or demanded for the release of someone or something from captivity. Now, we often think of that more traditional example of a kidnapper who demands a ransom in return for the release of his captive. But we might also think in a more modern sense of ransomware, which is viral software that's loaded onto a computer system, and it cripples the system by holding this critical data hostage until someone pays a hefty price, a ransom. So when Jesus says that he, the Son of Man, will suffer and die on the cross and give his life as a ransom for many, what he's saying is that by his passion, death, and resurrection, he will lay down his life as a ransom. He will pay that hefty price, that debt that we have incurred, in order to free us, God's beloved children, from the captivity and the enslavement of sin. To understand why a ransom is even needed, we have to go all the way back to the beginning in the book of Genesis, when our first parents, Adam and Eve, committed the original sin in the garden, when they refused their status as creature and instead insisted equality with God as creator by deciding for themselves what was right and what was wrong. And in doing so, sin entered the world. and it fractured our relationship with God, with creation, and with one another. And it also enslaved us to our own sin. So all throughout the Old Testament, we hear these stories of God attempting to deliver his people from slavery and lead them into greater freedom, only to watch them fall back into sin. It wasn't that God didn't know how to free them, it was that we still didn't know how to live in freedom. But what we hear in the gospel today, along with our first reading about the suffering servant from the book of the prophet Isaiah, is that God will once and for all definitively ransom us from our captivity to slavery and sin by the death and resurrection of his only begotten Son. In other words, God himself will become one of us. He will take on our human nature, our human flesh, and he will become like us in all things but sin. He will even allow himself to be tested, to be tempted. And he who is without sin becomes sin and suffers just like the rest of us. As the letter to the Hebrews tells us, there's nothing that we experience that Christ, our high priest, cannot sympathize with. And then he will go and do what you and I could never do for ourselves. He'll suffer and lay down his life as a ransom for ours. And with the debt now having been paid, the doors to eternal salvation have once more been opened to us. Everything that I've just described is what we call the Paschal mystery. It's what is at the center of our faith. Okay, so by now we know what he did, and we even have some idea of why he did it, because John chapter 3, verses 16 and 17 tell us. For God so loved the world that he gave his only Son, so that everyone who believes in him might not perish, but might have eternal life. For God did not send his Son into the world to condemn the world, but that the world might be saved through him. In short, he did it because he loves us, and because he wants us to be with him for eternity. But there's still one more question that's remaining to be answered. Other than understanding how Jesus Christ won our salvation for us and why he did it, why is it important for us right now? What does it mean for my life today on this beautiful Sunday morning? One of the things that this passage from Mark's Gospel tells us is that not only will Jesus suffer and give his life as a ransom, but we as his disciples will also be asked to drink from that same cup. You and I will encounter suffering in our lives. We know this all too well, as we not only experience suffering in our own lives, but sometimes we're asked to helplessly watch as those whom we love suffer as well. And when we find ourselves in this situation, and if you haven't, you will, we have a choice to make. There's two options. The first option is we can see our suffering and the suffering of others as a sign of a God who has forgotten us, abandoned us, or didn't love us enough to create a world that was free of suffering and death. Which, by the way, he did. And then we sinned and messed it all up. Or there's the second option. We can choose to join our sufferings to the suffering of Christ on the cross and see it as our opportunity to cooperate with his mission to redeem God's people. In short, we can offer our sufferings in our lives along with Christ as a ransom for many. We can willfully take up our cross, no matter how heavy it may seem at times, and follow him. By joining our sufferings to Christ's suffering and death, it gives what we are going through some sense of meaning. It can make our suffering redemptive like Christ's suffering. That it's not without purpose or benefit. But knowing that doesn't necessarily make it any easier. So when we are suffering, or someone we love is suffering, it can help for us to keep in mind two sayings of St. Paul. The first comes from his letter to the Romans, chapter 8, verse 18. I consider that the sufferings of this present time are as nothing compared to the glory to be revealed for us. And the second comes from his letter to the Colossians. Now I rejoice in my sufferings for your sake, and in my flesh I am filling up what is lacking in the afflictions of Christ on behalf of his body, which is the church. You see, without Christ offering his life as a ransom for many, through his passion, death, and resurrection, St. Paul and us would never be able to say those words with any sort of conviction. In fact, they would be quite meaningless. But what we celebrate today at this Mass, at this Eucharistic sacrifice by which Christ's redemptive suffering is made present to us, incarnate to us in his body and blood, is what allows us then to leave here with that same confidence, that hope, and that faith that St. Paul had. And rather than just keeping all that good news to ourselves, thinking only of our own needs and our wants, we can instead choose to go out and share those words of love, hope, and faith with the people who need them to hear them the most. And if we, as baptized Christians, as beloved sons and daughters of God, as disciples of Jesus Christ, who realize the immensity of what God has done for us out of his sheer love for us, if we don't go and do that, who will?